Young and the Restless spoilers. The storm brewing in Genoa City carried with it an unease that was difficult to name but impossible to ignore. At the center of it stood Victor Newman, a man who had built an empire with iron will and ruthless precision, a man both feared and admired, who now found himself staring into a future that seemed to stretch like a chessboard filled with unseen traps. The phone call he made was short, clipped, and deeply unsettling. Only he heard the response, and the silence that followed told the audience more than words ever could. For years, Victor had waged wars in boardrooms, toppled empires, rebuilt them from ashes, and crushed rivals who underestimated his resolve. But this time, the whispers hinted at something new, something darker, a shadow born not of men but of machines, and artificial intelligence threat poised to unravel everything he had built. Only Victor seemed aware of the scope of danger, and as he set the phone down, his expression betrayed the weight of a man who knew the attack looming was not just on Newman Enterprises but on the fragile balance of power that kept Genoa City from tearing itself apart. What made it worse was the declaration whispered in the background, a venomous promise from Mep, a figure whose shadowy presence now lingered like a ghost across every corporate move. His vow was chilling in its arrogance. Kane Ashby, Jack Abbott, and Billy Abbott would all fall in one blow. It wasn't the kind of threat tossed recklessly in a heated boardroom spat. It was a promise carved out of cold calculation, and the audience could feel its weight in the marrow of the story. Victor, who had spent decades fighting wars against the Abbotts, against corporate raiders, against opportunists and power-hungry manipulators, now stood at the crossroads of perhaps his most dangerous confrontation yet. The attack was not merely about stock shares or hostile takeovers, it was about identity, legacy, and the very survival of families whose names had defined Genoa City for generations. The cruel irony was that Victor might have the very power to stop this artificial intelligence-driven onslaught. The call he made hinted at plans not yet revealed, a contingency that involved dismantling the threat while also seizing an opportunity that others would find unthinkable. There was speculation that Newman Enterprises could simultaneously cripple Arabesque and Jabot, removing two rivals in one stroke. Yet the question remained, did Victor intend to use the crisis as an excuse to consolidate unprecedented control? Or was he still guided, if only faintly, by a sense of preservation for the city and the families that inhabited it? The ambiguity made every glance, every pause, every measured word from Victor a riddle wrapped in silence, and those who thought they knew his next move found themselves wrong-footed again. For Sally Spectra, however, none of these global-scale considerations mattered in the immediate sense. Her world was shrinking rapidly into a cage of betrayal and desperation. Sally had always carried herself with the energy of a survivor, a woman unafraid to reinvent herself, to claw her way through the judgments of others and prove that she could not just belong in Genoa City but thrive within it. Yet for all her resilience, she found herself disoriented by a wound she had not anticipated, wound of discovering that the man she loved had lied to her, and not about some trivial detail, but about the very foundation of trust between them. Billy had told her that Jack had withdrawn funding from Abbott Communications, a claim that painted Jack as unsupportive, detached, and unwilling to believe in their shared vision. Sally, in her need to believe in Billy, had accepted the narrative, only to find it collapse under the quiet but firm denial from Jack himself. The revelation was devastating because it turned love into quicksand. Instead of feeling betrayed by Jack, she was forced to confront the truth that Billy had deliberately manipulated her, bending her loyalty toward his reckless plan by inventing an obstacle that never existed. Billy's lie wasn't just about money, it was about control, about weaponizing her need for belonging and her hunger to prove herself. Sally, whose heart had already been bruised too many times by abandonment, by betrayal, by being seen as a woman who would never be enough, felt the air thicken around her as reality closed in. The choice to seek out Jack was not one of courage but of sheer desperation, a final gasp from someone drowning. Standing at the threshold of Abbott Manor, Sally carried with her the weight of humiliation. She knew Jack would see through her, she knew that he would recognize the fear trembling beneath her carefully rehearsed words. Yet she could not stop herself, because where else was there to turn? Billy had lied, and with that lie shattered, she needed some anchor to hold onto, someone who could cut through the chaos before she unraveled entirely. Jack listened with the quiet patience of a man who had lived too many wars of his own, who had seen love rise and fall like empires. He did not dismiss her outright, nor did he offer the absolution she craved. Instead, he reminded her, gently but firmly, that he had stepped back from Billy's chaos for a reason. Jack had no desire to refer yet another Abbott implosion, and though his heart went out to Sally's desperation, he made it clear that some battles were not his to fight anymore. The rejection hit her like ice water, not because Jack was cruel but because he was honest. In that moment, Sally realized how profoundly alone she was. Billy had lied. Jack had withdrawn. The circles of trust around her had collapsed one by one, leaving her in a hollow center where every move felt doomed. Desperation drove her mind to dark corners. What if she had misjudged everything? What if her choices had led her into a labyrinth where every turn was another betrayal waiting to happen? And yet, buried beneath the fear, a flame still burned. Sally was not someone who could disappear quietly into the night. She had fought too hard, survived too much, to let this be the end of her story. The pain might consume her for a time, but it also sharpened her resolve. Victor's looming plans and Sally's unraveling heartbreak existed on parallel tracks, each feeding into the larger storm gathering over Genoa City. The collision felt inevitable. If Victor moved forward with his plan to dismantle both Arabesque and Jabbet, the Abbotts would be forced into yet another war. One that would fracture their unity at a time when they could least afford it. Billy, already spinning out of control, would find himself in direct conflict with both Jack and Sally, a triangle of resentment and mistrust primed to ignite. Cain, caught in the crosshairs of Riamep's vendetta, would have to decide whether his loyalties lay in self-preservation or in forging alliances with those he once considered rivals. Every character, every family, every fragile bond seemed poised to break under the pressure of what was coming. For the audience, the thrill lay in the uncertainty. Would Victor reveal himself as the savior of Newman Enterprises or as the architect of a new empire built on ashes? Would Sally claw her way back from betrayal stronger than ever, or would her desperation drive her into alliances that would cost her more than love? Would the Abbotts finally find a way to unite against the storm, or would their fractures deepen until nothing remained? The pieces were on the board, the players locked into place, and the first moves had already been made. The only certainty was that Genoa City was on the cusp of another reckoning, and when the dust settled, no one would emerge unchanged. Billy Abbott's desperation had always been the thread that defined his choices, and in this latest chapter of chaos, it revealed itself with even greater intensity. His conviction that he could bend the world to his will through a mixture of charm, impulsive courage, and sheer audacity had carried him into victories before, but it had also broken him, left him in shambles, and forced those who loved him to pick up the pieces. Now, facing Victor Newman and his empire, Billy convinced himself that he had stumbled upon a weapon powerful enough to finally change the balance of power. A weapon tied to the artificial intelligence tool Cain had secured, a tool so dangerous and volatile that even whispering about its use conjured the scent of illegality. And yet, Billy's heart refused to see beyond the tantalizing possibility, a chance to seize Chancellor, to prove his mother wrong, to force Victor into submission, and to rise as the master of his own fate. The problem was never whether he could dream big enough, but whether he had the discipline to recognize the limits of dreams, especially when those dreams came shackled with risks that could obliterate him in the blink of an eye. Billy's conversations with Sally reflected the schism between intention and recklessness. He swore to her that he never intended to actually deploy the AI against Victor. He painted the picture of a bluff, a show of power that would shake Victor without crossing the threshold into a crime. He rationalized that his only goal was intimidation, not action, and that the mere suggestion of having such a weapon would be enough to bring Victor to heel. But Sally, more astute and more cautious than Billy was willing to admit, caught the flaw immediately. To even frame the idea was to dance with fire. She knew Victor, perhaps not as intimately as Nicky or his children, but enough to understand that he would never bow to fear without planting a counterstrike first. The mention of the word illegal during her later discussion with Jack and Diane did not merely raise eyebrows, it pierced the very fabric of their ongoing, already tense dialogue. It was one thing for Sally to stand before them as a woman betrayed by Billy's lies, but it was another entirely to unveil that Billy was charging headlong into a scheme that flirted openly with the criminal. Jack's brow tightened, Diane's lips thinned into a line, and the weight of the word hung in the air like smoke that no one could clear. For Jack, The notion that his brother was once again barreling into madness was hardly new, but the stakes this time made it unbearable. He had fought Victor on more fronts than he could count, but never would he have considered leveraging illegal threats or dangerous technologies to win. Jack was a man who valued pride and legacy, even when he stumbled. Diane, ever pragmatic and sharp, recognized not just the personal folly but the broader implications. If Billy dragged the Abbotts into a scandal tied to blackmail, the family name and Jabot's stability would crumble before their eyes. Sally, by uttering the word, had shattered the veneer of plausible deniability that Jack had tried to maintain about his brother's actions. Suddenly, it was no longer a private quarrel between siblings or lovers, it was a potential disaster looming over the Abbott family, a disaster that could make Victor's wrath look like mercy. Meanwhile, Billy himself grew increasingly consumed by his vision. His enthusiasm bordered on mania as he spoke of his plans to seize control of Chancellor, to restore himself as a leader who commanded respect, to crush Victor and finally silence the critics who painted him as reckless, weak, or perpetually doomed to self-destructs. Yet behind his rhetoric was a man motivated less by strategy than by emotion, less by reason than by the right of wanting to prove himself. His mother's disapproval cut deeper than any boardroom slight. His rivalry with Victor was not merely about business but about identity, about showing the world that Billy Abbott was more than a failed gambler, more than the wayward son, more than the brother who could not measure up. And that desire, as Kane so clearly saw, made him dangerous not because of his intelligence but because of his volatility. Kane's role in this unfolding storm revealed another layer of tension. When Billy demanded that their names be inscribed on the papers tied to Chancellor, it was less a request and more a frantic attempt to bind their fates together. Billy wanted Kane's signature as proof, as insurance, as validation that this scheme was not just a figment of his desperation but a shared path forward. But Kane's refusal cut through him like a blade. Kane's resistance implied dishonesty, or at the very least a lack of commitment, and it raised questions that Billy refused to ask aloud. Was Kane stringing him along? Was he a partner, or was he manipulating Billy's frenzy for his own gain? Kane's refusal to commit on paper cast a shadow over everything else, leaving Billy grasping at straws to hold together a partnership that might never have been real. What unsettled everyone the most, however, was Victor's unexpected move. Whispers spread that Victor had, under pressure, conceded Chancellor to Billy. The very idea seemed preposterous. Victor Newman did not bow, did not yield, did not give away power without already knowing how to retrieve it tenfold. If Victor agreed to such a move, the question was not why but what for. Did he see it as a temporary concession to placate Billy while plotting his counterstrike? Did he view it as bait, drawing Billy deeper into a web where his recklessness would expose him to law enforcement or corporate annihilation? Or was Victor, in some rare moment of calculation, allowing Billy the illusion of victory to destabilize him further? To prove to all of Genoa City that his enemies always fall hardest when they believe they've won. The flaw in Billy's plan was obvious to anyone with distance. Threatening Victor with AI was not leverage but suicide. Victor had resources far beyond Billy's comprehension, from his reach into law enforcement to his unparalleled ability to maneuver behind closed doors. If Billy ever dared to present his bluff as a demand, Victor could, with a single phone call, expose him, ruin him, and perhaps even destroy the Abbott family in the process. Kane's warnings about Billy's emotional thinking, his imbalance, his inability to separate personal vendettas from professional choices, echoed like prophecy. In Kane's eyes, Billy was not entering the game as a strategist but as a man already defeated, flailing in the throes of rage and desperation. And when a man fights from such a place, he rarely survives intact. For Sally, caught between loyalty and clarity, the heartbreak deepened. She had tried to believe in Billy, tried to forgive the lie, tried to rationalize the wildness of his ambition. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized that she stood beside a man not steering the ship but steering it straight into the rocks. Jack's warnings and Diane's sharp observations pressed against her conscience, forcing her to confront the truth she wanted to deny. Loving Billy might mean watching him implode, and by extension, watching herself go down with him. The desperation that had driven her to Jack's door now threatened to become despair, and in that despair, Sally would have to choose whether to remain tethered to Billy's chaos or to carve a different path, even if it meant breaking her own heart. And yet, the irony of it all was that Victor loomed above the chaos like a storm that had not yet broken. Every piece moved on the board: Billy's reckless schemes, Kane's careful withholding, Sally's desperation, Jack's concern into Victor's grand design. Whether he had truly yielded or whether the concession was another trap remained an unanswered question, but history suggested only one thing: Victor never surrendered unless he had already won.